What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the garage. Today we're going to talk about a topic that you see pop up online in welding communities all the time, and that is, can you get good welds with a flux core welder? And this comes up a lot because a lot of new people do tend to use flux core machines, and the welds may not come out looking the best. However, I'm here to tell you it is absolutely 100% possible to get good looking welds with a flux core welder. There's a few things you need to keep in mind if you're using flux core, and there are a few tips and tricks that you can use to help you get the best welds possible with flux core wire. So the first thing you're going to want to do is make sure your metal is as clean as you can possibly get it. Now, flux core does have the advantage of being able to work with some metal that has some surface rust or things like that, but if you want the best quality weld, you really need to make sure you do the prep work and clean everything really well. So I like to use these Scotch-Brite surface prep discs. They tend to clean off any mill scale or rust and preserve all of your edges, unlike a flap disc. A flap disc will clean metal, no problem. You just really got to watch and make sure you're not, grinding down any of the edges you want to preserve. You can also wipe down your metal with acetone or something along those lines to get any oils or anything off of them. Now, the next thing you want to do is you need to practice. Practice is the most important thing you can do to improve your weld quality. You're not going to get better if you don't do it. So find some scrap plates and just practice. Just practice running straight beads on here. Don't worry about a joint or joining two pieces at this point. Just run straight beads across a piece of steel and try to get them as straight as possible. When you're all done, clean it up, and then you can keep welding on that same piece. The next most important thing is to make sure the settings that you're using are correct for what you're welding. You need to vary your voltage on a flux core machine. Some have an independent wire feed control, others don't. It's tied in with the voltage setting. So just get to know your machine, find yourself a chart online and try and get that set up to where you have easy access to it, and you can use that as you learn to weld. And over time, you're just going to kind of know what your machine needs to be set at as you get used to the machine and you get used to welding in general. Now, another thing is going to be how you hold your welding gun. When you are flux core welding, you don't want to be straight up and down. You want to have this gun at a slight angle, and you'll see the different numbers for this angle online. What you really need to do, though, is just kind of get yourself set up where it's comfortable. I usually weld about right here at this angle, whatever this may be, and that tends to work for me, but it may vary for you, your wire, and the machine that you're using. So just keep that in mind. You don't want to be straight up and down. You do want to be at an angle, and usually you want to angle towards the way you're going to drag the gun. That brings us to our next point. With flux core, you don't really want to be pushing your weld. With flux core, you're going to have slag on the weld that you just did. So you want to be pulling away from that slag you've just created so that it doesn't get mixed into your weld puddle. If it gets mixed into the weld puddle, you're going to have things like gas bubbles and other imperfections and impurities within your puddle that are going to create voids and things like that within the weld itself. It can also compromise the quality of the weld and its strength. There's a saying in the welding community, if there's slag, you drag. So that means you never want to be pushing, you always want to be pulling. So pulling away from what you've already welded, dragging it away from where you've already been. The things we've just talked about, like clean metal, proper settings, practice, and dragging, and having your gun tipped at an angle, are all going to get you headed in the right direction towards quality welds. Now, part of the practice portion is something that's really important. You don't want to be moving too quickly. When you start moving too quickly, you're not going to get a weld that penetrates. You're also not going to be depositing enough new material in there to create a solid weld. That's when you start getting the little bubbles because the metal's not heating up enough to melt together, and it stays kind of on the surface. So you don't want to be moving too quickly. You want to be moving at a steady pace that's suitable for the thickness of material and the wire feed speed you have. That can be a little bit trial and error, so that's why practice is so important, because as you work with different thickness materials, you're going to have to adjust your speed as well as, the settings on the machine, like voltage and wire feed speed. You're going to have some spatter that is around the weld, and there's not a whole lot you can do about that. There's some sprays that make it easier to get off, but a lot of times it will just come off as you wire wheel it or hit it real quick with a flap disc. and it will look fine. And honestly, most of the time, depending on what the project is, you may not even have to worry about it. If it's something you're going to paint and finish out, then yeah, you're going to want to clean it up. Otherwise, it doesn't hurt to leave them. It just doesn't look as clean with them there. One of the challenging parts with flux core welding is the fact that your weld is going to be covered by slag when you're done with the weld. So as you're moving through, it can be difficult to see how your weld looks as you're welding. So it is kind of a good idea to do, make a weld, run a bead, stop, let it cool off a little bit and clean it up just to make sure you're on the right track. That way you can adjust any settings before you go through and weld the whole project where you can't see what your weld looks like. So with that being said, I'm just going to run a few beads on this plate. This is a 5/16 scrap plate that I found somewhere, so I'm going to use this. I really like plates like this for practice. You can really get a lot of welds on them, and then once you clean them up, you can weld right over the top of those again. And this metal's thick enough where it doesn't heat up super fast, and it's very difficult to actually burn through. So I'll bring the camera in closer, we'll run a few welds here. I'll try and do a weld too fast so you can kind of see what that looks like. So one thing I forgot to mention earlier when we were going through the tips and tricks is if you're having trouble with a certain wire, especially if it's a wire that came with a machine that you purchased or some no-name wire that you got off of Amazon, definitely try grabbing a spool of something name brand. I really like the 4i for the price and the quality. That's what I've got loaded in this machine right now, and that is definitely a thing that can cause you a lot of issues. There is such a thing as bad wire, and you can take that variable out by going to something that is more well known and more proven. Just something to keep in mind and take note of. So I'm going to be using the Simder MIG 140. I've done a review on this machine. I'll put a link up in the corner here. And I've really come to like this machine. It's super simple, easy to set up, easy to use. Does great welds. It'll also stick weld if that's something you need to do, all at a great price point. So check out that video, and there will be a link below also for this machine. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and do some beads on this 5/16 piece of plate. I apologize for the noise from the fan on the machine, but that's just life. I've got some 4i .035 wire loaded up in the Simder MIG 140 for this video. I ran about 5 or so on here. As you can see, these are all covered in slag right now. So this is what I was talking about earlier when I said it can be hard to see what's actually going on in your weld with flux core. Alright, so for the sake of transparency, I've just wire brushed these, and as you can see there's all these little spatter balls all over the place. I'm only, for this video, going to use a wire wheel to clean this up. I don't want to use a flap disc because I don't want anyone to think I'm like grinding these down or anything like that. So I'm only going to use a wire wheel just to get some of this spatter off, and then we'll take another look at them. So as you just saw, all I did was put a wire wheel to these, and most of that spatter is gone. If you worked at this just a couple quick hits with like a flap disc, most of all of that would be gone and you'd be left with just your weld beads. So the spatter is something you got to deal with and learn how to deal with. But like I said, for the sake of this video, I'm going to leave this as it sits now, just so I don't even have a flap disc or anything in this video. So as you can see, these welds look pretty decent. I mean, yeah, there's always room for improvement, and I am by no means a master welder or anything like that, but for flux core, these are pretty acceptable welds. But I would have no problem having almost any of these welds on a completed project that I did without having to grind them down. You know, they're nice and pretty uniform. I mean, anything that's not uniform is my fault, not the machine's fault. In this case, the machine was running fine. So this one down here is the one that I did go faster on purpose. And you can see it's thin and not as uniform as the rest of them. This one here I got a little shaky on, but other than that, these are all pretty decent welds. They'd all be acceptable. They all look pretty decent for somebody who's not a professional welder. That just is once again showing that you can get nice looking welds with a flux core machine, and it comes down to just, you know, the tips we've talked about in this video already. So this is an example of a weld that just got too hot. It is actually pretty uniform, but if you notice, it has a dull gray appearance to it versus the shiny welds you just saw on that plate. So this was too hot, so either I needed to pick up speed or turn the voltage down, and that is a sign, this coloration is a sign of a weld that is just too hot, and you know, it starts to discolor the metal. So as you saw, you can definitely get some nice looking welds with flux core. You know, it really comes down to just practice. The more you practice, the more you're going to know the welding process, the more you're going to know your machine, the more you're going to know what settings you need to use for different materials and different thicknesses. And you're going to start getting some muscle memory where you're not even going to have to think about it at a certain point. You're going to be able to set your machine and just go. But it does take the time. As long as you can keep yourself from getting frustrated, there's nothing overly difficult about learning to flux core weld. It's just a process of trial and error to an extent, and you just need to put the time in. If you put the time in and run beads, you're going to get better. Eventually you're going to get better. So look up photos of what a weld should look like. Look up photos of what a cold weld looks like, one that's too hot looks like. And then you can start to look at your own welds and decide what you're doing wrong and correct it. Because those corrections are what's going to get you to decent looking welds with a flux core machine. And it's going to help you across any welding process that you decide you want to try and learn. So this was kind of a quick and dirty tips and tricks to good flux core welds. If you want to see something more in depth, let me know in the comments below, and that's something I can work on in the future. I just wanted to get this out there to help some people and get them started in the right direction without having to watch a long video to do so. If you like content like this, please subscribe. And we do a live stream every Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Central Time. We'll see you next time back here in the garage.